The ancient world holds stories and secrets that feel almost unreal when we pause long enough to listen to them. Tonight, we're stepping into one of those stories. A civilization so advanced, it had running water, city planning, and standardized engineering thousands of years before much of the world had even settled down. A civilization that stretched across vast plains, traded with distant lands, and built cities of brick so precise they still puzzle archaeologists today. This was the Harappan civilization, also known as the Indus Valley civilization, one of the great ancient cultures of the world and one of the most mysterious. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your pillow. Let your shoulders relax. Maybe pull a blanket a little closer. If you enjoy these slow, late-night journeys into history, consider subscribing. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always comforting to know these stories are being heard in quiet rooms all around the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the day fade. Tonight, we'll travel back more than 4,000 years to a time when carefully planned cities stood along a powerful river system, when people bathed daily, built sophisticated drainage systems, and lived without kings, palaces, or towering monuments. These were cities that felt strangely modern, and then, somehow, they vanished. But before we walk among their silent streets, before we explore their baths, their homes, and their unanswered questions, we need to go further back. Because the Harappan world did not begin with grand cities or perfect grids. It began quietly, slowly, almost accidentally. And that is where our story truly starts. When we think of the Harappan civilization today, we imagine order. Wide streets laid out in neat grids. Brick houses built to precise standards. Covered drains running beneath entire cities. Public baths. Private wells. A level of organization that feels startlingly modern for a society that existed around 2600 BCE. At its height, this civilization covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It supported millions of people. It traded with distant lands. And yet, it left behind no kings, no epic inscriptions, no grand stories carved into stone. But it did not begin this way. Long before Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro became names whispered in history books, this land was something far simpler. It was a wide, open plain shaped by rivers that refused to stay still. The Indus River and its many tributaries flowed down from distant mountains, flooding gently, retreating slowly, and returning again with dependable patience. Each flood laid down a fresh layer of fertile soil, dark and rich, perfect for growing crops. The land did not demand conquest. It invited settlement. Small groups of people began to linger here, not because they planned to build cities, but because life was easier when the river cooperated. They planted seeds and watched them grow. They returned year after year. Temporary shelters became sturdier. Fires were built in the same places until the ground hardened beneath them. Slowly, without realizing it, people stopped moving on. There were no rulers announcing borders, no architects drawing master plans. What existed instead was rhythm. The rhythm of seasons, of floods and harvests, of rebuilding after water rose too high and adjusting after it pulled back. Mud was everywhere. Clay was shaped by hand, dried in the sun, and stacked into walls. At first, no two bricks were quite the same, but over time, something interesting happened. Certain sizes worked better. Certain shapes stacked more neatly. People noticed. They copied. Without ever holding a council or writing a rule, standardization emerged. This is how the Harappan world began, not through command, but through quiet agreement. Paths formed between homes. At first they curved around trees, old fire pits, places that carried memory. Later, as homes grew closer together, the paths straightened. Not because someone demanded it, but because walking straight was easier. Practicality shaped culture long before belief did. Water was everything. Wells were dug deeper. Access to clean water became a shared concern. Not sacred yet, not ritualized, just understood. A settlement that protected its water survived. One that didn't moved on or disappeared. Children grew up knowing one place instead of many. They learned the smell of wet earth after a flood, the sound of birds returning, the way the land warmed before water rose again. Pottery improved. Hands learned the wheel. Designs repeated until they felt familiar, comforting, almost soothing. There was no writing carved into stone to announce this transformation. If early symbols existed, they were fleeting, scratched into clay, remembered more than recorded. Stories lived in voices, not monuments. And because of that, no one thought to describe what was happening. A civilization was forming without ever naming itself. Floods still came, sometimes stronger than expected. Homes washed away. But people did not abandon the land entirely. They rebuilt slightly higher, smarter. They adapted. Each flood became a lesson rather than a catastrophe. Over generations, settlements grew denser. Courtyards appeared. Homes clustered together, balancing privacy with shared space. Order emerged not from force, but from cooperation. The land rewarded patience, and the people learned restraint. This was the moment before history notices itself, before cities rose high enough to be mapped, before streets became straight enough to impress future archaeologists, before the silence. As the sun set over the Indus plain, smoke curled upward from countless hearths. Fires burned steadily. Meals were cooked. Children slept. No one knew they were laying the foundation for one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations. They were simply living, and somewhere beneath their feet, the ground was already preparing to remember them. Harappa did not announce itself. There were no trumpets, no ceremonial first stone laid beneath the watchful eyes of priests or kings. No moment when anyone could point and say, "This is where a city begins." Harappa arrived the way morning does, slowly, almost apologetically, until one day it was simply there, undeniable, woven into the landscape as if it had always belonged. At first, it was nothing more than a clustering of homes along the river's reach. A place where people returned not just seasonally, but habitually. The land offered enough water, enough soil, enough predictability to encourage staying. Not permanence yet, just repetition. Fires were lit in the same spots. Paths were walked so often that grass gave way to packed earth. Children grew up recognizing the same horizons their parents had known. The idea of leaving became less attractive than the comfort of knowing exactly where the river bent and how high the floodwaters usually climbed. Harappa's earliest buildings were humble. Mud bricks shaped by hand, dried under the sun, stacked carefully but without grandeur. These were not monuments. They were shelters meant to last through heat, rain, and the quiet erosion of time. Walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the weather. Roofs low enough to repair easily. Nothing excessive. Nothing symbolic. Just functional spaces shaped by people who expected to live in them for years, not seasons. What's striking is how little ego appears in these early choices. No structure dominates the others. No home announces importance. There is no visible center of power, no elevated residence claiming authority over the rest. Instead, houses sit beside houses, each modest, each purposeful. If hierarchy existed, it left no architectural footprint. This was a place built for living, not for display. As more families settled, the spaces between homes began to matter. Narrow paths formed naturally, where people walked most often between wells, cooking areas, storage spaces, and meeting points. These paths weren't designed. They were worn into existence by daily life. Over time, they straightened, not because of planning, but because efficiency has a way of asserting itself. Walking the shortest distance becomes instinctive when done thousands of times. Slowly, these paths widened. What had once been informal tracks became recognizable streets. Still modest, still unadorned, but increasingly deliberate. Homes aligned themselves along these routes, respecting shared movement. The city was not imposed on the people. It grew outward from their habits. Harappa was shaping itself without instruction, guided by use rather than vision. One of the most remarkable aspects of this growth is what never appears. There are no towering temples rising above the rooftops, no palaces set apart from the rest, no grand staircases or ceremonial gates demanding attention. In many ancient civilizations, early cities announce power through scale. Harappa does not. Its silence is architectural. The city refuses to shout. This absence is not accidental. It suggests a society that did not organize itself around visible authority. No ruler felt the need to dominate the skyline. No priesthood carved out sacred ground above the rest of daily life. Whatever beliefs existed, and surely they did, they were practiced quietly, woven into routine rather than broadcast in stone. The sacred, if present, lived alongside the ordinary. As the settlement expanded, building materials became more consistent. Brick sizes began to standardize, not through decree, but through shared understanding. Certain dimensions worked better. They stacked cleanly. They lasted longer. Builders copied what held. Over generations, this quiet consensus turned into remarkable uniformity. Harappa's bricks began to follow ratios so precise that modern engineers still marvel at them. Yet no blueprint survives. No inscription claims credit. The knowledge passed hand to hand, mind to mind. With permanence came investment. Wells were dug deeper and more carefully lined. Drainage channels appeared not as afterthoughts, but as essential components of every home. Water was managed with care and foresight. Waste was guided away from living spaces, channeled beneath streets rather than ignored. This level of concern speaks volumes. It suggests a community thinking collectively, valuing shared cleanliness and health over individual convenience. And still, no one celebrated this transformation. No festival marked the moment Harappa crossed the invisible line from settlement to city. Life simply became denser, quieter in some ways, more interdependent. People woke each day surrounded by others whose routines intertwined with their own. Cooperation was no longer optional. It was embedded in the environment. Markets likely emerged without formal designation. A corner where goods were exchanged more often than elsewhere. A shaded space where craftspeople gathered. Not monumental squares, but functional hubs shaped by repeated use. Pottery became finer, tools more specialized. Trade networks extended outward, quietly linking Harappa to distant regions through goods rather than words. What's most haunting about this phase of Harappa's growth is how little drama it contains. History often favors moments of conquest, collapse, or declaration. Harappa offers none of these. Its birth is almost invisible. A city growing the way a coral reef grows layer by layer, organism by organism, each contribution small, but together forming something immense. Children born during this time inherited a world already leaning toward permanence. They learned streets before trails, walls before tents. They grew up assuming that homes stayed put, that neighbors remained neighbors. The idea of constant movement faded. Roots took hold. Memory accumulated in place rather than carried away. Even conflict, if it existed, left no scars we can clearly see. There are no fortifications bristling with fear, no weapons piled in anticipation. Harappa does not appear to have grown under threat. Its confidence feels quiet, almost naive by later standards. A city assuming continuity because it has never known otherwise. As decades passed into centuries, Harappa's footprint widened. More homes, more streets, more wells. The city breathed outward, Always measured, never frantic. Each addition felt like an extension of what already worked rather than a radical change. Stability was the innovation. What makes this moment extraordinary is that no one living through it would have recognized its significance. They did not know they were building one of the earliest great urban centers in human history. They were not trying to be remembered. They were solving immediate problems: where to live, how to manage water, how to coexist. The scale of their achievement only becomes visible when viewed from thousands of years away. This is the paradox of Harappa's birth. Something enormous formed without ambition. Something complex emerged without command. A city arose not because people sought greatness, but because they sought continuity. By the time Harappa could be called a city in any meaningful sense, its foundations were already ancient. The habits that shaped it were generations old. Its streets held the memory of countless footsteps. Its walls carried the quiet confidence of structures built to endure without needing to impress. Harappa did not rise. It settled. And in doing so, it set the stage for something unprecedented. A civilization defined not by kings or conquest, but by balance, restraint, and the quiet agreement of ordinary people choosing to stay. Unnoticed by the wider world, something vast had taken root. Mohenjo-Daro does not burst into existence. It wakes up. Not suddenly, not violently, but with the slow clarity of a place, realizing what it has become. Where Harappa grew quietly, almost shyly, Mohenjo-Daro opens its eyes already organized, already confident, already thinking in straight lines. This is where the Indus Valley begins to feel unsettlingly familiar. From above, if anyone at the time could have imagined such a view, the city resolves into a grid. Streets run straight and true, intersecting at near right angles. Main avenues are broad enough for carts and foot traffic to coexist without friction. Smaller lanes branch off with purpose, not randomness. This is not the accidental geometry of paths worn by habit. This is intention made visible. And yet, no inscription claims authorship. No ruler's name anchors the design. The grid exists without ego. Each block feels measured. Houses align with one another as if agreeing silently on boundaries. Walls meet streets cleanly, without the defensive awkwardness seen in later fortified cities. This is not a city bracing for attack. It is a city trusting itself. What immediately sets Mohenjo-Daro apart is its relationship with water. Not reverence, not fear. Mastery, quiet, methodical mastery. Almost every home has access to a well. Not a communal well serving dozens, but private or shared wells spaced so generously that water is never far away. They are circular, carefully lined with baked bricks, engineered to last. Drawing water is not a privilege here. It is an assumption. Drainage runs everywhere, and it runs beneath notice. Covered channels line the streets, sloping gently, guiding wastewater away from living spaces. Inspection holes are built in, allowing maintenance long before problems arise. This is infrastructure thinking centuries ahead of its time. The city does not react to waste. It anticipates it. What's remarkable is how invisible this system is meant to be. The drains are covered. Waste is hidden. Cleanliness is not performative. It is expected. Order is not enforced loudly. It simply functions. Walking through Mohenjo-Daro would feel calm. Not silent, but measured. The noise of daily life contained within walls that respect one another. Cooking fires burn. Footsteps echo softly. Water splashes against stone. There is no chaos pressing in from the edges. This calm is not accidental. It is designed. Homes are built inward, centered around courtyards. Windows do not gape open onto the street. Privacy matters here. The city does not demand constant public display. Life unfolds within contained spaces, protected from dust, heat, and scrutiny. Bathing spaces appear repeatedly. Not ceremonial pools for elites, but practical washing areas woven into domestic life. Clean water flows in. Dirty water flows out. The rhythm repeats daily. Cleanliness is routine, not ritualized. At the heart of the city sits the Great Bath. It does not dominate the skyline. It does not tower. It rests, solid and assured, its brickwork sealed with bitumen to keep water in and decay out. Steps descend into the pool with symmetry and care. Surrounding rooms suggest preparation, gathering, transition. Yet even here, the mystery remains. No inscription explains its purpose. Was it religious, civic, social? The structure refuses to declare itself. What is clear is the respect given to water. The bath is not decorative. It is engineered. Water enters deliberately. Water leaves deliberately. Nothing here is left to chance. Water, in Mohenjo-Daro, is the true ruler. Not a king, not a council. Water dictates the city's form, its rhythms, its priorities. Streets slope gently to accommodate drainage. Wells anchor neighborhoods. Baths define communal order. The city bends around water, not the other way around. And because of this, Mohenjo-Daro feels modern in a way that is deeply unsettling. There are no palaces shouting authority. No temples rising to claim divine favor. No statues looming over public squares. Power does not announce itself here. Governance, if it exists, is infrastructural. The city tells its people how to live without telling them what to believe. This absence of spectacle creates a strange psychological effect. You are not meant to be impressed. You are meant to function. Even storage buildings, granaries, and workspaces follow the same disciplined logic. Brick sizes remain consistent. Street widths remain predictable. Corners meet cleanly. There is a sense that deviation is unnecessary because the system already works. This level of coordination suggests shared values enforced not through threat, but through consensus. Builders across generations follow the same ratios. Planners respect the same alignments. Maintenance happens quietly. Someone cleaned the drains. Someone repaired the wells. Someone ensured the city remained calm. And yet, we do not know who. No crowns, no named officials, no royal tombs. The people who sustained this order remain anonymous, absorbed into the fabric of the city itself. Mohenjo-Daro does not feel loud. It does not feel crowded. It feels settled. This is perhaps its most disorienting quality. Other ancient cities overwhelm with scale or symbolism. Mohenjo-Daro disarms with restraint. It feels like a place designed for daily life rather than for legacy. Children could walk these streets safely. Water would be nearby. Waste would be carried away. The city does not punish movement or reward status. It accommodates. Even its height is modest. Buildings rise 2, sometimes 3 stories. Enough density for community, not enough to cast oppressive shadows. Light reaches courtyards. Air circulates. Heat disperses. This is climate-aware urbanism long before the term existed. The grid is not rigid. It is forgiving. Streets adjust slightly to terrain. Drains adapt. Wells respond to need. The order is flexible, not authoritarian. It is tempting to imagine a central planner, a visionary mind behind it all. But the city resists that narrative. Its intelligence feels collective, iterative, refined through practice rather than decree. Generation after generation adjusted, improved, standardized, not because someone demanded it, but because it made life easier. Mohenjo-Daro feels like a city that trusts its people. That trust extends to materials. Baked bricks require resources and planning. They are not the cheapest option. They are chosen because they last, because floods come, because time erodes weaker things. This city is built with an understanding of impermanence and a refusal to surrender to it. And still, there is no excess. No gold in the streets. No marble facades. No exaggerated monuments. Wealth, if present, is not shouted. It is invested in systems, clean water, safe streets, orderly space. This is civic ambition, stripped of vanity. Standing in Mohenjo-Daro, one would not feel small beneath power. One would feel held by competence. That calm is perhaps the most radical feature of all. In later civilizations, cities become instruments of control. Walls intimidate, temples command, palaces dominate. Mohenjo-Daro does none of this. It does not threaten. It does not impress. It simply works. And that is what makes it eerie. Because a city this organized, this clean, this thoughtful should not exist so early in human history. It challenges the story that complexity requires hierarchy, that order demands rulers, that cleanliness follows authority. Mohenjo-Daro suggests another path, one where cooperation quietly replaces coercion, where water governs more effectively than kings, where civic life is not loud, but reliable. As the city fully wakes into itself, its rhythm steady. Wells are drawn from, drains carry away the day, streets hold their lines, baths fill and empty. Life continues without spectacle. Something extraordinary has emerged, not through conquest or command, but through calm persistence. And like all things built quietly, its strength is easy to underestimate. For now, Mohenjo-Daro stands serene, balanced, confident in its systems. A city not shouting its greatness, but living it, unaware, as all cities are, of what lies ahead. There is a silence at the center of the Harappan world, and it is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of something deliberately missing. Everywhere else in the ancient world, power announces itself loudly. Kings carve their names into stone. Rulers raise statues to fix their faces in eternity. Tombs swell into mountains, airing time to forget who commanded whom. Authority is meant to be seen, felt, feared. But here, across Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and the dozens of cities spread along the Indus, there is nothing. No royal tombs waiting to be discovered beneath layers of earth. No colossal statues staring down from ruined plazas. No inscriptions proclaiming divine right or heroic lineage. The absence is so complete that it becomes unsettling. This is not a civilization that forgot to celebrate its rulers. It is a civilization that appears to have functioned without them. Archaeologists searched for decades, expecting the familiar signs to emerge eventually. Surely the palace must be somewhere. Surely the king's burial lies hidden beneath a mound, not yet excavated. Surely the statues were destroyed or carried away. But the deeper the excavations went, the clearer the pattern became. There were no kings to find. The cities reveal impressive planning, standardized materials, shared cultural symbols, and long-distance trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. Someone coordinated brick sizes across vast regions. Someone maintained consistent weights and measures. Someone oversaw drainage systems, urban layouts, and public works. Decisions were made, rules were followed, order was sustained. And yet, no single individual steps forward from the ruins to claim credit. This creates a deeply uncomfortable question. Who decided anything? In most ancient societies, power is visible because it needs to be enforced. Commands require authority. Authority requires symbols. Symbols require hierarchy. The Harappan civilization breaks that logic. Here, power seems to have been distributed so thoroughly that it left no obvious center. Houses differ in size, but not dramatically. There are no sprawling estates dominating neighborhoods. No compounds screaming wealth while others collapse around them. Even the largest buildings, granaries, assembly-like structures, baths, serve communal functions rather than personal prestige. Burials follow the same pattern. Graves are modest. Grave goods are restrained. There is no explosion of wealth buried with a single individual. No golden masks, no chariots. No evidence of divine rulers preparing for eternal afterlives. Death, like life, appears orderly and equal. This does not mean inequality didn't exist. Humans rarely erase hierarchy entirely, but whatever hierarchy existed here did not rely on spectacle. Power, if it existed, did not need to be seen to be obeyed. That is what makes this civilization feel alien. Consider the absence of ruler imagery. In Egypt, pharaohs stare out for walls and statues endlessly. In Mesopotamia, kings pose triumphantly over enemies. Even in smaller cultures, leaders ensure they are remembered. In the Indus Valley, the seals tell a different story. Animals dominate the iconography. Bulls, unicorn-like creatures, elephants, mythic hybrids. Human figures appear rarely, and when they do, they are ambiguous. No crowns, no thrones, no unmistakable declarations of rule. If leadership existed, it did not depend on personal glorification. Instead, authority seems embedded in systems. Brick sizes are standardized across cities hundreds of miles apart. This requires agreement, not coercion. Drainage systems are maintained consistently, suggesting coordinated labor over generations. Trade weights are uniform, implying shared economic rules enforced through trust. Someone ensured fairness. Someone enforced standards. But no one demanded monuments in return. This hints at a form of governance radically different from later empires. Perhaps councils, perhaps guilds, perhaps priestly administrators who avoided personalization. Or perhaps authority rotated, dissolved into the collective, never lingering long enough to fossilize into kingship. We cannot say for certain. And that uncertainty is the most disturbing part. Because power usually leaves fingerprints. Even when records are lost, ambition tends to carve scars into architecture. But here, ambition appears to have been restrained, redirected, or culturally discouraged. The cities function not because one voice shouted orders, but because many voices quietly agreed. That kind of cohesion is rare. It requires social trust on a scale that feels almost impossible for ancient societies. Shared values strong enough to outlast individual leaders. Cultural norms powerful enough to regulate behavior without constant enforcement. This suggests that the Harappan people may have viewed authority as a responsibility, not a performance. Decisions were made, but they were absorbed into daily life rather than celebrated. Leadership expressed itself through maintenance rather than domination. Clean streets instead of triumphal arches. Reliable water instead of royal processions. Standardized bricks instead of statues. In this world, power did not shout. It whispered. And because it whispered, it left fewer traces. The unsettling part is not just that we cannot find kings. It is that the civilization thrived without needing them. For centuries. This challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about how complex societies work. We often assume that scale requires hierarchy, that coordination demands command, that cities grow only under strong centralized authority. The Indus Valley quietly contradicts that narrative. Here was a civilization spanning 1 million square kilometers, managing agriculture, trade, urban planning, and craft specialization, without obvious rulers. It raises uncomfortable comparisons. What if power can exist without spectacle? What if order can emerge from shared norms rather than enforced fear? What if authority does not require a face? The Harappans may have answered these questions not through philosophy, but through practice. Their cities do not feel oppressed. They feel calm. Their layouts do not intimidate. They accommodate. Their public spaces invite participation rather than awe. Even the Great Bath, often cited as a ceremonial center, avoids grandeur. It is well built, not ostentatious. It invites use, not reverence. There is no throne overlooking it, no raised platform asserting dominance. Just water, steps, brick, balance. This restraint suggests a cultural resistance to concentrated power. A belief, perhaps unspoken, that authority should dissolve into function rather than crystallize into individuals. That belief would explain the absence of ruler imagery. Why elevate one person when the system matters more? It would also explain the uniformity across cities. Shared practices passed laterally rather than imposed vertically. Standards spread through consensus. Rules enforced through expectation. Leadership expressed through stewardship. Of course, this model comes with fragility. Without visible power structures, systems rely heavily on cultural continuity. They work as long as everyone believes in them, as long as trust holds, as long as shared values remain intact. There are no kings to blame when things go wrong, no palaces to burn, no tyrants to overthrow. When stress arrives from climate shifts, trade disruptions, population pressures, the system has fewer dramatic release valves. Authority without spectacle is efficient, but it can also be brittle, and still, for centuries, it held. This makes the eventual disappearance of the Harappan civilization even more haunting, because it did not collapse in flames. It did not fall to conquest. It did not leave behind tales of tyrants or wars. It faded. A civilization built on quiet authority dissolved quietly. No royal line ended. No dynasty fell. No king's name was erased. Just systems gradually abandoned. Cities slowly emptied. Standards loosened. Unity thinned. Power that never centered on individuals could not rally around them in crisis. The same feature that made the Harappan world feel calm also made it vulnerable. But that comes later. For now, in its height, the Indus Valley civilization stands as an anomaly, an ancient society that organized itself without crowns, without kings, without the need to immortalize authority. A place where decisions were made, but not announced. Where power existed, but did not demand worship. Where order was maintained not by fear of rulers, but by faith in systems. And that, perhaps, is the most radical legacy of all. Because long after the bricks crumble and the streets fill with dust, the question remains, echoing softly through the ruins, what kind of civilization chooses not to be ruled? And what happens when such a civilization begins to forget how it once governed itself? The answers, like the kings, are nowhere to be seen. If you strip away the mystery, the silence, the unanswered questions, what remains of the Harappan civilization is not grandeur but routine, not spectacle but repetition. Along the Indus and its tributaries, life unfolded not in moments meant to be remembered, but in days meant to be lived again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. This was a civilization built not on drama, but on habit, on the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be trusted. The homes tell this story first. Most houses were built of baked brick, sturdy and deliberate, arranged around small inner courtyards. These courtyards were not decorative. They were the heart of the home. Light spilled down into them. Air moved through them. Life gathered there in the early morning and again in the evening, when the heat softened and shadows stretched across the brick floors. You can imagine the sounds. Footsteps on hard-packed earth. The scrape of pottery set down too quickly. Water poured from a jar into a basin. A low murmur of voices, not raised, not theatrical, simply present. Cooking smells drifted through these spaces. Grain ground into flour. Flatbreads baking on clay hearths. Lentils simmering slowly. Oil warming. Smoke curling upward, guided out through vents designed with care. Food was not prepared in isolation, but as part of the daily rhythm, repeated so often that the movements became instinct. Hands knew where everything belonged. Storage jars lined the walls. Smaller vessels held spices or oils. Grinding stones were set into the floor, worn smooth by years of use. These tools were not precious objects. They were extensions of the body, shaped by repetition, reshaped by time. The houses varied in size, but not wildly. There were no slums pressed against palaces. No dramatic contrasts between excess and scarcity. Most people lived in homes that reflected a shared standard of comfort, modest, functional, reliable. Doors opened inward. Windows were few, positioned high for privacy and cooling. Streets outside remained orderly, but the true life of the household unfolded within these enclosed spaces, protected from dust, noise, and strangers. Children grew up in these courtyards. They learned the rhythms early: when to fetch water, when to stay out of the way, when to help, and when to play. Small footprints once crossed these floors. Tiny hands once reached for beads and bits of clay. Toys were simple: miniature carts with wheels, small animals molded from terracotta, clay balls worn smooth by rolling across brick surfaces. These were not toys designed to entertain endlessly. They were toys meant to teach familiarity with the adult world. Play mirrored life. A child pushing a tiny cart learned balance, movement, direction. A child shaping clay learned pressure, patience, form. Games did not exist to distract from reality, but to prepare for it. Beads were everywhere. They were made from stone, shell, faience, and fired clay. Some were tiny, drilled with astonishing precision. Others were larger, bold in color. Bead making was not an elite craft reserved for ritual. It was everyday artistry. You can imagine a child sitting beside an adult, stringing beads together, fingers learning dexterity, or watching closely as a drill spun carefully, slowly piercing stone without cracking it. These skills were passed down quietly, through observation rather than instruction. There were pets. Dogs appear frequently in Harappan art, suggesting companionship as well as utility. They likely guarded homes, accompanied people through streets, and slept near doorways at night. Their presence adds warmth to the image of these cities, living creatures sharing space, not just serving function. Livestock moved through the edges of urban life. Cattle, goats, and sheep were essential, but not overwhelming. They were managed, integrated, kept from dominating the streets. Urban planning accounted for animals without surrendering to chaos. Daily routines repeated with remarkable consistency. Water was fetched from wells, often located within homes or just outside them. This eliminated the drama of daily survival seen in other ancient cities. No long treks. No central bottleneck where conflict brewed. Water flowed into life quietly, predictably. Bathing was regular. Not ceremonial bathing, but practical cleanliness. Washing hands, rinsing feet, cooling the body after heat. Drains carried waste away efficiently, preventing stagnation. Cleanliness was not spiritual theater. It was maintenance. This shaped the psychology of daily life. When waste disappears, when water is reliable, when streets remain navigable, stress diminishes. People can focus on repetition instead of crisis, on continuity instead of survival. Pottery filled every aspect of life. Cooking pots blackened by fire, storage jars sealed with care, cups shaped for hands accustomed to them. Pottery styles remained consistent across regions, suggesting shared aesthetic values reinforced through routine use. A pot did not need to impress. It needed to work. Broken vessels were discarded, replaced without ceremony. There is no evidence of ritual smashing, no dramatic symbolism. Objects lived, broke, and were forgotten. Time moved differently here. Without monumental events dominating memory, life likely felt cyclical. Seasons marked by subtle shifts rather than dramatic festivals. Agricultural rhythms guided the year: planting, harvesting, storage, preparation. Even trade operated with quiet regularity. Goods moved along routes established over generations. Seals marked ownership or agreement, not conquest. Traders likely knew one another by reputation rather than command. Trust replaced threat. Daily labor was distributed across households and neighborhoods. Craftspeople worked near homes. Production was integrated into domestic space rather than isolated into massive workshops. This blurred the line between work and life. Skills were learned early, practiced often, refined slowly. The absence of palaces meant the absence of spectacle. No daily reminders of power looming overhead. No royal processions disrupting routines. No forced labor for monuments. The city existed to serve life, not to glorify rulers. This made repetition possible. Stability is born from predictability. And predictability, repeated over generations, becomes culture. Children grew up knowing where things belonged, how streets flowed, how water behaved, how people behaved. Social norms were reinforced not through punishment, but through constant exposure. Civilization here was not a performance, it was muscle memory. Morning followed night. Work followed rest. Food followed hunger. Cleanliness followed use. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for life to feel complete. This does not mean life was easy. Illness existed. Accidents happened. Droughts came, but daily systems softened their impact. There was no single point of failure dominating existence. When something broke, it was repaired. When a routine failed, another took its place. The emotional tone of these cities feels muted, grounded, not ecstatic, not fearful, calm. The archaeological remains support this impression. There is little evidence of sudden violence. Few signs of fortification against internal unrest. Weapons exist, but they do not dominate the material record. Life was not organized around conflict. Instead, it revolved around continuity. This may explain why the civilization left so few dramatic stories behind. Drama requires disruption, and disruption was minimized here. Stories lived in repetition rather than retelling. Generations experienced similar days, similar spaces, similar tasks. Memory flowed through doing, not narrating. Even death seems to have been approached without spectacle. Burials were orderly, restrained. The dead were placed with care, but not extravagance. Grief likely existed, but it did not erupt into monuments. Life continued. This everydayness is what allowed the civilization to spread so widely. You can replicate systems built on repetition. You can transplant routines. You can teach habits. You cannot easily replicate charisma, divine kingship, or spectacle. The Harappan world expanded because its way of life could be learned quietly. Build your house like this. Lay your streets like this. Use bricks of this size. Wash this way. Trade this way. No sermons required. This is the kind of civilization that does not announce itself. It simply appears fully formed because it grew slowly enough to feel inevitable. And that is why its disappearance feels so haunting. When a civilization built on drama collapses, it leaves ruins that shout. When a civilization built on routine dissolves, it leaves silence. The streets empty. The courtyards fill with dust. The wells dry. The routines break, one by one, not with fire, not with conquest, but with interruption. For now, though, we remain in the middle of life. A child rolling a clay toy across a courtyard. A pot warming on a hearth. A dog sleeping in the shade. A bead threaded onto a string. Civilization not as an empire, but as a habit. And habits, once broken, are the hardest to explain, because no one remembers when they first began. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro, set apart from homes and workshops, lies a structure that refuses to behave like anything else in the ancient world. It is not a palace. It is not a temple. It is not a tomb. It does not glorify a ruler, house a god, or memorialize the dead. Instead, it holds water. The great bath of Mohenjo-Daro is quiet, deliberate, and strangely intimate for a structure built by thousands of people working together. It sits on a raised platform, carefully constructed from baked bricks sealed with bitumen, making it watertight in a way that feels almost modern. Steps descend into it from both ends, symmetrical and controlled, as if entering the water itself required balance and intention. There is no throne nearby, no altar carved with dramatic reliefs, no towering statue demanding reverence, just a pool. This absence is what makes the Great Bath so unsettling. In other ancient civilizations, sacredness announces itself loudly. Gods loom, kings loom. Architecture overwhelms the senses. Here, the most carefully constructed space is designed for immersion, not intimidation. The water is the focus. Archaeologists have measured the basin with fascination. Its proportions are precise. Its walls are reinforced. Drainage channels ensure that water can be emptied and refreshed. This was not a decorative feature or a seasonal pond. It was maintained, respected, returned to again and again. Someone decided that water mattered enough to be given this level of care. But who? There is no inscription explaining its purpose. No relief carving of priests performing rituals. No myth frozen into stone. We are left to infer meaning from architecture alone, and what it suggests is quietly radical. The Great Bath implies ritual without spectacle. Whatever happened here did not require an audience. It did not demand grandeur. It did not leave behind trophies or offerings meant to impress future generations. The act itself was the meaning. Entering the water, submerging, emerging changed, if only briefly. In this civilization, spirituality appears to have flowed inward rather than upward. There are no temples towering over the city, no sanctuaries dominating skylines. Instead, the most sacred structure is sunken into the earth, open to the sky, accessible by steps rather than guarded thresholds. This inversion matters. It suggests a belief system grounded not in hierarchy, but in participation. Not in mediation by priests or kings, but in shared experience. Anyone who entered the Great Bath followed the same steps, touched the same water, stood at the same level. Water here equalized. And water was already central to Harappan life, long before ritual entered the picture. Everyday cleanliness permeated these cities. Wells were everywhere. Drains ran beneath streets. Homes were designed with washing spaces. Wastewater was guided away methodically, preventing stagnation and disease. Cleanliness was not occasional. It was continuous. This constant interaction with water shaped how people thought about it. When water is reliable, it becomes invisible. When it disappears, it becomes sacred. The Harappans seem to have occupied a middle space. They respected water not as a distant miracle, but as a daily presence deserving care. This relationship likely deepened into belief. Not belief in a god of water towering above the world, but belief in water itself as a force of order, renewal, and balance. The Great Bath may have been used for rites of passage, for seasonal renewal, for communal purification, or perhaps for all of these, without strict boundaries between them. The lack of evidence for exclusive priestly control suggests openness. The bath was not hidden deep within restricted precincts. It was prominent, central, visible. But visible does not mean theatrical. There are no grand approaches, no processional avenues, no raised platforms for observation. The focus remains inward, on the experience of water against skin, not on performance. This aligns with the broader Harappan tendency toward restraint. Where other civilizations carved gods into stone, the Harappans left symbols, ambiguous, abstract, resistant to fixed interpretation. Where others built temples to reach the heavens, the Harappans built systems to manage water. This does not mean they lacked spirituality. It means their spirituality took a different form. Cleanliness itself appears to have carried moral weight. To be clean was to be ordered. To be orderly was to be in harmony. Dirt, stagnation, and decay were not just physical problems, but disruptions of balance. In this worldview, washing was not merely hygienic. It was corrective. The Great Bath magnified this principle. Unlike household washing spaces, it required effort to access. You had to go there deliberately. You had to step down, leave the city behind, enter a controlled environment. This separation hints at ritual intent. Yet nothing about the space enforces fear or submission. The steps are broad. The proportions are human-scaled. The surrounding rooms suggest preparation, not control. The ritual, if it existed, did not demand obedience. It invited participation. And importantly, it did not require belief in a story. There are no myths carved into the walls explaining why the bath mattered. No legends to memorize. No divine genealogy. Water itself was enough. This may be why Harappan belief systems feel so elusive today. They were not encoded in narrative. They were encoded in practice. To understand them, you had to live them. To wake up, to wash, to clean your space, to maintain order. To repeat these acts daily, and then to gather occasionally in a shared space to perform them collectively, with intention. The Great Bath may have functioned as a reset point for the city, a place where individuals rejoined the collective not through words or oaths, but through shared immersion. This is a profoundly different model of sacredness. It suggests that belief was not about transcending the body, but honoring it. Not about escaping the world, but maintaining it. Water carried away impurities, yes, but also noise, tension, imbalance. In a city designed for calm, the bath reinforced calm. There is something deeply modern in this idea. Today, we speak of mindfulness, of grounding, of rituals that require no doctrine, of wellness rooted in repetition and care. The Harappans were practicing a version of this thousands of years ago. But unlike modern wellness culture, theirs was not individualistic. It was communal. You did not cleanse yourself to stand apart. You cleansed yourself to rejoin. This interpretation is strengthened by the absence of competing sacred spaces. There are no rival temples, no evidence of sectarian division. The Great Bath stands alone, not because it dominated belief, but because belief did not fracture into institutions. Water unified. It is possible that the Great Bath also marked seasonal cycles. Floods and droughts shaped life along the Indus. Water levels rose and fell. Fields depended on timing. Immersion in water may have symbolized alignment with these rhythms. Entering the bath could have marked transitions between seasons, between roles, between stages of life. Yet even if these rituals existed, they left no trace of coercion, no signs of sacrifice, no evidence of exclusion, no markers of elite control. This suggests a belief system that trusted its participants. And that trust mirrors the broader civic trust evident in Harappan cities. Trains worked because people used them properly. Streets stayed orderly because people respected them. Water remained clean because it was cared for collectively. Spirituality and infrastructure were not separate realms. They reinforced each other. The Great Bath was not isolated from daily life. It was an extension of it, elevated through intention. And this may be why it has captured modern imagination so strongly. We are accustomed to ancient religions that shout their presence, gods that demand, rulers that proclaim. The Great Bath whispers. It tells us that a civilization can center its beliefs on maintenance rather than myth, on balance rather than power. It also tells us something unsettling. A belief system rooted in practice rather than narrative leaves fewer traces when it disappears. There are no scriptures to copy, no temples to repurpose, no gods to conquer. When the routines break, belief evaporates. And this may be why the Harappan civilization fades so quietly from history. When water systems fail, when wells dry, when rivers shift, the belief system tied to them loses its anchor. The Great Bath becomes an empty shell, still impressive, still mysterious, but silent. Standing before its remains today, we feel this silence intensely. We do not know the words spoken here. We do not know the gestures performed. We do not know the emotions carried into the water, but we can feel the intention, care, restraint, balance. In a world often defined by excess and domination, the Harappans built their sacred space around the most basic human need: water, not as spectacle, not as conquest, but as belief itself. And in doing so, they left behind a question that still lingers, like ripples fading across a still surface. What if the most powerful form of faith is not loud enough to survive its own disappearance? What if the greatest civilizations are not remembered because they conquered, but because, for a time, they learned how to live cleanly, together, and quietly? The Great Bath does not answer this. It simply waits. The Harappan world did not expand with armies. It did not march outward behind banners or carve its name into conquered stone. And yet, its presence traveled astonishing distances, quietly, steadily, without leaving scars of invasion behind. This was a civilization that moved not by force, but by exchange. Long before empires learned to dominate through conquest, the cities of the Indus were already connected to lands hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers away. Copper from distant hills, semi-precious stones from arid plateaus, shells from far-off coasts, timber from forests that never touched the Indus floodplains. None of these resources naturally belonged to Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro, yet they flowed into these cities with remarkable consistency. Trade routes formed not as borders pushing outward, but as threads weaving places together. The evidence appears slowly, almost shyly. A bead carved from carnelian, discovered far from the Indus. A seal stamped with unfamiliar symbols, turning up in Mesopotamia. Weights standardized to Harappan measures found in foreign markets. These objects do not shout their origin. They simply exist, out of place, carrying quiet proof of connection. Harappan seals are the most compelling travelers of all. Small, square, carefully carved, often depicting animals unicorn-like creatures, bulls, elephants, alongside symbols that still refuse to be read. These seals have been unearthed far beyond the Indus Valley, in places where Harappan armies never stood. They appear in Mesopotamian cities like ghosts. The Mesopotamians even had a name for this distant land: Meluha, a place known not through war, but through goods, through traders, through reputation. This alone sets the Harappans apart. Most ancient civilizations become known to others through conflict first. Raids, invasions, resistance. Only later through commerce. The Harappans inverted this pattern. They introduced themselves through reliability. Goods arrived as promised. Weights matched expectations. Materials were consistent. The system worked. Trade on this scale requires trust, and trust does not flourish in chaos. For Harappan trade networks to function, merchants had to travel safely across long distances. This implies roads, resting points, agreements, and shared expectations. It implies that people recognized Harappan measures, seals, and standards as legitimate. No empire enforced this legitimacy. No king demanded compliance. Instead, the system depended on mutual benefit. Merchants, not soldiers, carried Harappan influence outward. They did not build fortresses. They built relationships. We can imagine these traders moving slowly along riverbanks and desert edges, caravans pacing themselves with the seasons, ships hugging coastlines from the Indus Delta toward the Persian Gulf. They carried beads, pottery, textiles, metals. In return, they brought back materials the Indus cities could not produce themselves. This exchange was not extractive. It was reciprocal. And that reciprocity shaped the character of Harappan civilization itself. Because trade without conquest requires restraint. You cannot terrorize the people you depend on. You cannot destabilize roots you rely upon. You cannot impose your will without risking collapse. So instead, the Harappans standardized. They created weights that could be recognized across regions, measures precise enough to eliminate constant negotiation, seals that authenticated goods without needing written contracts. This is commerce built on predictability, and predictability requires social stability at home. The cities of the Indus were not just producing goods, they were producing confidence. When a Harappan seal arrived in a foreign market, it signaled something important. This product would meet expectations. This trader would honor agreements. This system was dependable. That reputation spread farther than any army. It is telling that we find Harappan artifacts in Mesopotamia, but not Mesopotamian administrative structures in the Indus Valley. Influence flowed outward, but domination did not flow back. The Harappans did not absorb foreign gods, scripts, or political hierarchies in response to trade. Their cities remained internally consistent. Trade enriched, but did not transform them. This suggests a civilization confident enough not to imitate. Harappan society did not need to proclaim superiority. It demonstrated it quietly through functionality. Even the materials chosen for trade reflect this mindset. Beads were carefully drilled with astonishing precision. Pottery was standardized, yet elegant. Tools were functional, not ornamental. Luxury existed, but it was subtle. Nothing about Harappan trade screams excess. Instead, it whispers refinement. Merchants likely occupied an important role within this society, but not a dominating one. There is no archaeological evidence of merchant palaces or elite trading dynasties. No grand monuments celebrating commerce. Trade was essential, but not glorified. This balance matters. In many later civilizations, wealth accumulation concentrates power. Merchants become elites. Elites demand influence. Influence reshapes society. The Harappans appear to have avoided this cycle. Trade served the civilization, not the other way around. This restraint may explain why Harappan cities retained such remarkable uniformity across vast distances. Standardized bricks, consistent layouts, shared measures. Trade did not introduce fragmentation. It reinforced cohesion, because the goal was not expansion, but maintenance. The Harappan world was already large enough. Their cities stretched across a territory bigger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They did not need to conquer more land to thrive. They needed to manage what they already had. Trade extended their reach without extending their footprint. This approach also shaped how their civilization was perceived by outsiders. To Mesopotamian scribes, Meluhha was distant, exotic, but not threatening. It was a source of valuable goods, not armies. A partner, not a rival. That distinction matters in how civilizations survive interaction. The Harappans were not erased by invasion during their height. They were not conquered and absorbed. They remained autonomous, stable, and internally coherent for centuries. Their decline, when it comes, will not arrive on the backs of enemy chariots. It will come from something quieter. But for now, trade sustains them. Trade keeps their cities humming. Workshops produce goods not only for local use, but for distant demand. Bead makers drill stone with obsessive care. Potters replicate forms with minimal variation. Craftspeople work within systems refined over generations. This repetition is not stagnation, it is mastery. Trade rewards consistency, and consistency becomes culture. The movement of goods also moves ideas, though subtly. Techniques spread, styles influence, yet Harappan art remains reserved, controlled. Even when foreign materials arrive, they are adapted to local aesthetics. There is no explosion of foreign motifs, no dramatic shifts. The Harappans absorbed without being absorbed. This suggests a strong cultural core, one that did not feel threatened by exchange. Merchants traveling these routes likely served as ambassadors, though unofficial ones. They carried not just goods, but stories. They spoke of cities with drains and wells, of markets that ran smoothly, of streets laid out with care. In doing so, they spread an idea of civilization that did not rely on intimidation. This idea may have been as valuable as the goods themselves. A model of urban life that prioritized order over spectacle, cooperation over conquest. It is tempting to imagine that this model could have spread further, reshaping ancient history. But history favors noise. Empires that conquer leave ruins that demand attention. Civilizations that trade leave trails that fade. The Harappans chose the quieter path. Their influence spread like water, seeping through soil, rather than fire racing across fields. And because of that, when their cities eventually decline, they do so without traumatic collapse. No burned layers. No mass graves from invasion. No triumphant enemy inscriptions. Trade networks thin. Routes shift. Goods stop arriving. Workshops slow. Cities contract. The same quietness that defined their rise shapes their disappearance. But for centuries, trade without empire worked. It sustained one of the largest urban civilizations the world had ever seen. It connected people without binding them under a single ruler. It proved that complexity did not require conquest. Standing at the edge of this realization, we are left with an uncomfortable thought. What if domination was never inevitable? What if civilization did not need kings, armies, and empires to function at scale? The Harappans offer no manifesto. They leave no argument carved in stone. They simply show us, through seals found far from home, through standardized weights in distant markets, through the absence of conquest, that another way once existed. A civilization that spread not by force, but by trust, quietly, patiently, until the world around it changed. And when it did, the Harappans did not fight to be remembered. They simply faded, leaving behind small objects far from where they were made, waiting for someone thousands of years later to notice the pattern and wonder how such a vast civilization moved so gently through the ancient world. The Harappans spoke. Of this there is no doubt. They marked, stamped, carved, and impressed their thoughts into stone, clay, and seal. They left behind hundreds, perhaps thousands of short messages scattered across their cities and trade routes. And yet, despite all this effort, their voices remain silent to us. We can see their writing everywhere, but we cannot hear what it says. The Indus script is one of the great frustrations of human history. It appears confidently, without hesitation, as if it belonged to a society that fully expected to be understood. Symbols repeat, patterns emerge. Certain signs appear at the beginning of inscriptions, others at the end. Some combinations are common, others rare. This is not random decoration. This is language, or something very close to it, operating with internal rules. And still, it refuses to open. Most Indus inscriptions are short, often no more than 5 to 7 symbols long. The longest known example contains just over 20. There are no long texts, no epic poems carved into walls, no royal decrees, no prayers etched into temples. Just brief sequences, pressed carefully into seals or scratched onto pottery. This brevity is part of the mystery. It suggests that writing was not used for storytelling or historical record in the way we expect. Instead, it seems functional, administrative, identifying ownership, origin, perhaps profession or lineage. The kind of writing meant to accompany daily life, not immortalize it. And yet, even this modest role leaves us stranded, because without knowing the sounds, the grammar, or the meaning behind these symbols, we cannot even begin. The Indus script consists of several hundred distinct signs. Some are simple strokes or shapes. Others resemble animals, plants, tools, or abstract forms. A fish-like symbol appears frequently. So do shapes resembling jars, tridents, arrows, and geometric marks. But resemblance is a trap. A fish symbol may not mean fish. It may represent a sound, a concept, a title, or something entirely unrelated. Without a bilingual text, without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, we are left guessing. And guesses have filled libraries. Some scholars argue the script represents a spoken language, possibly an early Dravidian tongue. Others suggest it may encode multiple languages, or even function as a system of symbols not tied to speech at all. There are theories proposing it was mnemonic, ritualistic, or even emblematic rather than linguistic. Each theory builds elegant structures. Each collapses under scrutiny, because none can be proven. The problem is not a lack of intelligence or effort. It is a lack of anchors. When Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered, scholars had long inscriptions, known kings, bilingual texts, and historical continuity. When Mesopotamian cuneiform was decoded, it came with archives of tablets, economic records, myths, letters. The Indus offers none of this. Its writing floats in isolation. Seals are the most common medium. Small, square, portable, carved with an image, often an animal, and a line of symbols above it. These seals were likely pressed into clay to mark goods, containers, or documents. They traveled far. Seals bearing Indus script have been found outside the Indus Valley, in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf region. This tells us something crucial. Whatever these symbols meant, people beyond the Indus recognized them as meaningful. They were trusted. But trusted to do what? Authenticate trade? Identify merchants? Mark quality or quantity? Indicate origin? We cannot say. What we do know is that the script was standardized. Symbols are consistent across regions, separated by vast distances. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro used the same signs arranged in similar ways. Smaller towns followed the same conventions. This implies centralized agreement, even without centralized rule. Somehow, across an enormous civilization, people agreed on how to write, and they maintained that agreement for centuries. That alone is extraordinary. Writing systems tend to evolve quickly. Symbols drift. Forms change. Meanings shift. But the Indus script remains remarkably stable across time and space. This stability suggests control, education, and shared norms. But who enforced them? There were no scribal schools discovered. No writing tablets used for practice. No classrooms etched into ruins. Perhaps writing was restricted to a small group. Merchants, administrators, seal makers. Perhaps literacy was specialized, not widespread. Or perhaps writing was so embedded in daily life that formal instruction left little trace. Again, silence. What makes the Indus script especially haunting is not just that we cannot read it, but that it appears everywhere. On seals, on pottery, on tools, on ornaments, on small tablets of unknown purpose. The Harappans surrounded themselves with written symbols, and yet they left no story explaining why. Imagine a civilization today, leaving behind only barcodes and logos. No books, no letters, no inscriptions explaining themselves. Future scholars might recognize the patterns, but miss the meaning entirely. That may be what we face with the Indus, a writing system optimized for function, not memory. The frustration deepens when we consider what we might have learned. We could know how the Harappans organized their society, what they believed, how they understood the world, what words they used for water, for home, for community, for death. Instead, we are left with guesses drawn from bricks and bones. The script stands between us and their inner life, and it does not yield. Some researchers have tried computational approaches, frequency analysis, pattern recognition, statistical modeling. These methods confirm what we already suspect. The script behaves like language. It has syntax like ordering, preferred symbol positions, structural rules. But knowing that something behaves like language is not the same as understanding it. It is like hearing a voice through a wall. You know someone is speaking. You recognize rhythm, repetition, pauses, but the words never reach you. This is what the Indus script feels like. A civilization speaking forever, unheard. There is a particular cruelty in this silence, because the Harappans were otherwise so legible. Their cities make sense. Their engineering is clear. Their daily lives can be reconstructed with care. And yet their thoughts remain locked. We can trace their drains, but not their dreams. We can map their streets, but not their stories. Some scholars suggest that perhaps the Harappans did not value writing as we do, that speech, ritual, and practice mattered more than record-keeping. That memory lived in people, not text. This may be true, but even so, they chose to write something. Enough to leave behind thousands of inscriptions. Enough to frustrate us for generations. There is also the unsettling possibility that the script was never meant to be read by outsiders, that its purpose was internal, contextual, obvious to those within the system, but opaque to those outside it. A closed language. If so, it worked perfectly, because even now, with all our tools, we remain outside. The silence of the script mirrors the silence of Harappan decline. No final messages, no pleas, no explanations. Writing does not narrate their end. It simply stops appearing. At some point, the seals cease. The symbols vanish. The system dissolves. And with it, the last direct voice of the Harappans. What remains is absence. This absence shapes how we think about them. Without written records, we cannot impose familiar hierarchies. We cannot name kings. We cannot quote laws. We cannot recount wars or treaties. The Harappans resist narration. They deny us the comfort of knowing. Perhaps this is fitting for a civilization that avoided spectacle. Their writing is quiet, minimal, functional. It does not shout across millennia. It waits, and maybe it always will. Each generation returns to the Indus script with new tools, new hopes, new confidence. And each generation leaves humbled. The script does not bend to urgency. It reminds us that not all histories want to be read. Some exist simply to show that they existed. The Harappans spoke. They marked their world with symbols. They communicated with each other efficiently enough to build one of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world. They just did not speak to us. And that silence, stretching across 4,000 years, may be the most honest legacy they left behind, because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. That civilization does not need to explain itself to be real. That meaning can exist without narration. That a people can build, trade, govern, and believe without leaving behind words we can understand. The Indus script remains carved, pressed, repeated. A voice without sound. A message without translation. A civilization speaking forever, while the world listens in vain, leaning closer, hoping that someday, somehow, the silence will finally break. When we search the ruins of the Harappan world for art, we do not find what we expect. There are no colossal statues looming over plazas, no stone gods carved with thunderous authority, no temples lined with reliefs depicting divine punishment or royal triumph. Instead, we find small things, objects meant to be held in the hand, figures that fit easily on a shelf, a table, a windowsill, art that does not demand submission, only attention. This is the first quiet shock of Harappan art. It is intimate. The most famous pieces are figurines, many made of terracotta, some cast in bronze, others carved from stone or shell. They are modest in size, often no taller than a handspan. You do not look up at them. You look across at them. Sometimes you look down. They meet you at human scale. One of the most striking examples is a small bronze figure often called the dancing girl, a Mohenjo-Daro. She stands with one hand on her hip, the other resting casually at her side. Her posture is confident, relaxed, almost playful. She wears bangles stacked high on one arm, her head tilted slightly, her weight shifted to one leg. There is no stiffness here, no ritual pose. She feels alive. She is not a goddess. There are no symbols marking her as divine, no halo, no throne, no weapons. If she represents anything sacred, it is not the kind of sacred that dominates. It is the sacredness of presence, of motion, of being comfortable in one's own body. This alone sets Harappan art apart from much of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, gods tower over humans, carved larger, heavier, more imposing. In Egypt, deities are immortalized at monumental scale, fused with kingship, order, and cosmic authority. Even in later South Asian traditions, divine figures grow immense, layered with iconography, symbolism, and hierarchy. The Harappans did not do this. Their art does not intimidate. It does not instruct through fear. It does not elevate the divine far above the human. Instead, it stays close. Terracotta figurines of humans appear frequently. Some are stylized, others surprisingly detailed. Hairstyles are carefully rendered. Jewelry is emphasized. Clothing is minimal but intentional. Faces are often simplified, but bodies are expressive. Many figurines depict women. Some scholars once rushed to label them fertility goddesses, assuming that any ancient female figure must be divine. But this assumption has been increasingly questioned. There is little evidence that these figures were worshipped as gods. They lack consistent iconography. They vary widely in form and style. They appear in domestic contexts, not temples. They may simply be people, or representations of people, or ideals of beauty, health, adornment, adulthood. They do not demand reverence. They invite recognition. Male figures exist too, though less frequently. They are often seated, sometimes bearded, occasionally wearing elaborate headdresses. One stone figure, sometimes called the priest king, wears a patterned robe and a headband, his gaze calm and introspective. But even here, the title is speculative. There is no inscription calling him a priest, no throne beneath him, no aura of command. He looks thoughtful, not powerful. If this is leadership, it is subdued. Animals dominate Harappan art even more than humans. Bulls, unicorn-like creatures, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, water buffalo, goats. They appear on seals, carved with careful attention to anatomy and posture. Muscles are defined. Horns curve naturally. Feet are grounded. These animals feel observed, not imagined. They are not mythic monsters breathing fire or guarding cosmic gates. They are creatures of the land and river, known to the people who carved them. Even the so-called unicorn, a common motif on seals, does not behave like a mythical being. It is depicted in profile, calm, tethered, often facing a ritual stand. It may represent a real animal stylized through convention, or a symbol whose meaning we no longer understand. But it does not dominate the scene. It participates. There is a gentleness to Harappan animal art, a respect. Animals are not crushed beneath heroes' feet. They are not trophies of conquest. They stand alone, dignified, present. This tells us something important. Art reflects values, and Harappan art does not glorify domination. It does not celebrate violence. Weapons are rare in artistic depictions. Scenes of battle are absent. There are no reliefs showing enemies defeated, cities burned, kings triumphant. If war existed, it was not commemorated in art. Instead, beauty resides in form, balance, and familiarity. Even decorative arts follow this principle. Pottery is painted with geometric patterns, plants, animals, flowing lines. Designs repeat rhythmically. There is symmetry, but not rigidity. The eye moves calmly across surfaces. This is not art meant to overwhelm. It is art meant to live alongside daily life. Beads are another window into this aesthetic. Harappan bead making was extraordinarily sophisticated. Carnelian, agate, lapis lazuli, shell, faience. Beads were drilled with precision, polished carefully, strung into necklaces, bracelets, anklets. These were not crude ornaments. They required skill, patience, and aesthetic judgment. People wore beauty, and beauty was portable. There is no evidence that only elites had access to ornamentation. Jewelry appears in many contexts. This suggests that aesthetic expression was not tightly controlled by class or ritual hierarchy. Art belonged to people, not institutions. This may explain the absence of monumental art. Monumental art requires centralized power, surplus labor, and a desire to project authority. It requires someone to say, "Build this here in my name." The Harappans do not seem to have had such a someone. Their art does not speak in the voice of command. It whispers in the voice of craft. Even seals, which may have held administrative power, are beautifully carved. The animals are balanced, the lines precise, the composition thoughtful. These were tools, yes, but also objects of care. Function did not exclude beauty, and beauty did not require gods. The absence of towering deities is especially striking. There are no clear temples, no cult statues, no standardized divine forms repeated across cities. If gods existed, they were not centralized, monumentalized, or enforced through iconography. This does not mean the Harappans were not spiritual. It means their spirituality may have been quiet, internal, woven into routine rather than staged in spectacle. The Great Bath may have held ritual significance, but it is architectural, not sculptural. It focuses on experience, not imagery. Water, movement, cleanliness. Belief expressed through practice, not idols. Art follows the same logic. Rather than presenting gods to be feared, Harappan art presents life to be recognized. A dancer, an animal, a pattern, a gesture. This makes their art feel strangely modern. It resonates with later aesthetic philosophies that value minimalism, human scale, and restraint. It feels closer to contemporary sensibilities than to the bombast of many ancient empires. And yet, it is ancient. 4,000 years old. This raises unsettling questions. What kind of society chooses not to glorify its rulers or gods through art? What kind of power structure does not need visual reinforcement? Perhaps authority was not concentrated enough to demand representation. Perhaps social cohesion relied on shared norms rather than imposed imagery. Perhaps belief did not require constant visual assertion. Or perhaps art served a different purpose entirely. It may have been personal rather than political, expressive rather than declarative, comforting rather than commanding. This would align with the overall tone of Harappan civilization. Cities designed for flow, not intimidation. Homes that prioritize courtyards and privacy rather than display. Infrastructure that supports daily life quietly. Art fits into this pattern seamlessly. It does not interrupt, it accompanies. There is also a sense of restraint. Harappan art avoids excess. Even when skilled, it remains controlled. Lines are clean, forms are contained. Nothing spills outward dramatically. This restraint suggests cultural discipline, not repression, but balance, an understanding of limits. In a world where many civilizations shouted their presence into history, the Harappans chose a softer voice. And that softness may be why they are harder to hear. Without gods carved in stone, without kings frozen in triumph, without myths etched into walls, there is less for later ages to latch onto. Their art does not explain itself. It does not announce its meaning. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, waiting to be noticed, not worshipped. This kind of art resists appropriation. It cannot easily be used to justify conquest, lineage, or divine right. It does not tell later rulers how to rule. It does not offer symbols of power to inherit. Perhaps that is why it remained buried so long. Perhaps a civilization without intimidating gods leaves fewer echoes in empires obsessed with authority. And yet, when we finally notice it, the effect is profound. because it suggests another way of being ancient. A civilization that valued order without oppression, beauty without fear, belief without spectacle, art without gods towering overhead, art that meets you at eye level, art that feels like it belonged to people who trusted the world enough not to shout at it. In the soft curve of a bronze arm, in the careful etching of an animal's horn, in the rhythm of painted lines on clay, we glimpse a culture that did not need to prove its greatness. It simply lived it. And that, perhaps, is the most radical art of all. What makes the Harappan civilization most unsettling is not what it built, but how casually it built it. There is no sense of spectacle in its engineering. No single structure that screams ambition. No architectural flex meant to intimidate gods or rivals. Instead, there is a quiet, relentless competence woven into the most ordinary parts of life. Streets, drains, walls, bricks, things so mundane that we almost miss them. And yet, taken together, they reveal one of the most sophisticated urban engineering systems of the ancient world, hidden deliberately inside normalcy. Walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, and the first thing you notice is order. Streets intersect at near right angles. Neighborhoods feel planned rather than accidental. Main roads are wide enough for carts. Smaller lanes branch off toward homes, and everything seems to follow an invisible logic. This is not the organic sprawl of villages slowly growing into towns. This is intention. Someone, or more likely a shared system of thinking, decided where things should go long before the first bricks were laid. And those bricks matter. Harappan bricks were standardized across an enormous area. From present-day Pakistan to western India, bricks follow the same ratio, roughly 1 to 2 to 4 in height, width, and length. This is not decorative coincidence. It is industrial discipline. Brick molds had to be agreed upon. Kilns had to be calibrated. Builders across hundreds of miles had to follow the same measurements without a central empire enforcing them with force. Standardization is power, but this power is invisible. There are no inscriptions praising the authority that mandated brick sizes. No royal decree etched in stone. The system simply exists, working silently, city after city. It suggests cooperation at scale, not coercion. A shared understanding that consistency mattered, not because a king demanded it, but because life worked better when walls aligned, drains connected, and structures fit together predictably. Nowhere is this clearer than in the drainage systems. Harappan drains are legendary for a reason. Almost every house, even modest ones, had access to drainage. Wastewater flowed from bathrooms and kitchens into covered street drains lined with brick or stone. These drains were not crude ditches. They were carefully constructed, with removable covers for cleaning, slight gradients to ensure flow, and junctions that connected private homes to public infrastructure. This alone is extraordinary. In many ancient civilizations, sanitation was an afterthought or a privilege of elites. Here, it appears universal. Cleanliness was not reserved for palaces, because there were no palaces. It was embedded in the daily experience of ordinary people. A person bathing in a small home had access to the same logic of water management as someone living closer to the city center. Engineering here is democratic. It does not elevate one group above another. It serves everyone quietly. And because it serves quietly, it almost disappears. Consider how much planning this required. Streets had to be laid with drainage in mind. Homes had to be positioned to connect to the system. Materials had to withstand constant water flow. Maintenance had to be possible without disrupting the entire city. This implies not just technical knowledge, but long-term thinking. An understanding that cities are not static monuments, but living systems that need care. And yet, there is no evidence of centralized bureaucratic buildings where engineers ruled from above. No inscriptions listing departments of public works. No statues of master builders. The knowledge seems distributed, embedded in practice rather than hierarchy. Urban planning in the Harappan world feels less like command and more like consensus. Cities are divided into zones, often described as citadel and lower town, but even this terminology can be misleading. The so-called citadel areas do not house palaces. They contain public structures, storage facilities, and sometimes the Great Bath. They sit slightly elevated, perhaps for protection from floods, perhaps for symbolic reasons, but not to loom over the population. Elevation here is practical, not political. The lower town is where most people lived, in houses that followed similar layouts. Courtyards, rooms opening inward, thick walls for insulation. These homes were not shacks. They were solid, well-built, durable. The repetition of design suggests shared solutions to climate, privacy, and daily routine. This repetition is important. It shows that engineering was not experimental chaos. It was refined, tested, passed down. And yet, it does not feel rigid. Cities vary slightly in layout. Streets bend where terrain demands it. Drain systems adapt. This is not blind uniformity. It is flexible standardization, a balance that even modern urban planners struggle to achieve. The genius lies in how little it calls attention to itself. Most ancient engineering achievements are designed to be noticed. Pyramids demand awe. Ziggurats climb toward the sky. Roman aqueducts stride across valleys like declarations of dominance. Harappan engineering stays low. It runs underground. It hides beneath floors. It supports rather than dominates. The most advanced systems are the least visible. Take water management. Wells are everywhere in Mohenjo-Daro. Hundreds of them. Not centralized fountains, but distributed access points. Almost every neighborhood had wells, sometimes even private ones. This decentralization reduces dependence, increases resilience, and prevents power from being hoarded through control of water. Water is life, and the Harappans refused to let it become leverage. Drainage channels connect to soak pits that filtered waste before it returned to the ground. This shows an understanding, however intuitive, of sanitation and environmental balance. Waste was not simply dumped, it was managed. Again, without spectacle. The materials themselves reveal care. Fired bricks resist water better than sun-dried ones. Stone is used where strength matters. Wood, now mostly gone, likely played a role in roofing and structural support. Everything chosen for function, not display. There is an almost modern humility in this approach. Engineering is not used to glorify leaders or intimidate subjects. It is used to make life smoother, cleaner, quieter. Streets that drain properly mean fewer floods. Standardized bricks mean quicker repairs. Covered drains mean less disease. Wells mean independence. The result is a city that hums rather than roars. And this hum is easy to overlook. Archaeologists sometimes struggle to convey the brilliance of Harappan engineering because it lacks drama. There is no single structure to point to and say, look. Instead, one must say, notice how everything works. This is harder. It requires slowing down. It requires appreciating systems rather than symbols. And perhaps this is why the Harappan civilization feels so distant to us. We are drawn to narratives of kings, wars, collapses. The Harappans offer routines, maintenance, continuity. Their genius is not loud enough for traditional history to grab onto easily. Even their urban decline does not appear to involve sudden destruction. There are no widespread burn layers, no clear evidence of invasion. Infrastructure slowly deteriorates. Drains clog, bricks are reused, streets narrow. Order fades gradually, which suggests that the civilization's strength was also its vulnerability. When engineering is collective and authority is diffuse, collapse may be quieter too. But during its height, the Harappan world achieved something remarkable. It created cities where ordinary life was supported at an extraordinary level. where children grew up with clean water and predictable streets, where households could rely on systems larger than themselves without feeling dominated by them. This is engineering as care, engineering as background, engineering as trust. The people who designed these cities did not carve their names into stone. They did not demand remembrance. They left behind drains that still functioned thousands of years later, bricks that still align, streets that still make sense. They trusted that usefulness was enough. In a way, they were right. Because even now, as we sift through ruins and map foundations, we are forced to confront a different definition of greatness. Not the tallest structures, not the loudest monuments, but the quiet mastery of everyday needs. The Harappans engineered the ordinary so well that it became extraordinary only in hindsight. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson buried beneath their cities. That true genius does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply works, day after day, unnoticed, until the people who built it are gone. And all that remains is the question of how something so calm, so practical, so quietly intelligent ever existed at all. For centuries, the land had agreed to cooperate. The rivers flowed when they were expected to flow. The monsoons arrived with reassuring regularity. Floods came, but they were familiar, seasonal, manageable. The Indus Valley civilization was built on this quiet contract between people and environment, a mutual understanding shaped over generations. Cities rose not by conquering nature, but by listening to it, adapting to its rhythms, and trusting that those rhythms would continue. And for a long time, they did. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the agreement began to loosen. Rivers are not fixed things. They wander, braid, split, and rejoin. They respond to forces far beyond human-controlled tectonic shifts, glacial melt, distant rainfall patterns, subtle changes in elevation. For thousands of years, the rivers that sustained Harappan cities followed paths that made settlement possible. Water reached fields. Silt renewed the soil. Channels remained close enough to support trade and daily life. But gradually, those paths began to change. The Indus itself, along with its tributaries, started to behave differently. Channels shifted eastward or westward. Some rivers that once flowed year-round became seasonal. Others broke into smaller streams, unreliable and shallow. In certain regions, rivers moved so far from established cities that wells began to fail. Fields dried unevenly, and the infrastructure built to manage water no longer matched the water's new behavior. This was not a single catastrophic event. There was no dramatic moment when the rivers vanished overnight. Instead, there was confusion. A well that once filled easily now took longer. A familiar flood arrived earlier than expected, or later, or not at all. Drainage systems designed for predictable water volumes began to strain under sudden surges or long dry spells. Floods, once welcome and renewing, grew unpredictable. In some years, rivers overflowed violently, cutting through embankments and eroding foundations. Streets carefully aligned for drainage were overwhelmed. Mud brick walls softened. Storage areas flooded unexpectedly. In other years, the floods barely came, leaving fields thirsty and harvests uncertain. The balance between too much water and too little became harder to maintain. Unpredictability is more dangerous than scarcity. A dry year can be planned for. A wet year can be endured. But alternating extremes undermine confidence. They erode trust not just in the land, but in the systems built to manage it. The Harappan cities had been designed for stability. Their genius lay in standardization and predictability. When nature stopped behaving predictably, those strengths became fragile. At the same time, the monsoon patterns began to weaken. The summer monsoon, which brought life-giving rains from the southwest, slowly lost its reliability. Climate records suggest a gradual decline in monsoon intensity over centuries, not decades. Rainfall became patchier. Some regions received less water overall. Others experienced bursts of intense rain, separated by long dry periods. This unevenness made agriculture more difficult, especially for crops that depended on steady moisture rather than sudden downpours. Farmers would have noticed first. Seeds planted at the usual time failed to sprout. Crops that once thrived began to struggle. Yields became inconsistent. Storage facilities, once filled with surplus, saw thinner reserves. Trade networks could compensate for local shortages for a while, but as climate stress spread across regions, those networks themselves became strained. The land was not turning hostile. It was becoming indifferent, and indifference is harder to negotiate with. As rainfall patterns shifted, so did vegetation. Grasslands thinned, forest edges retreated. Soil quality changed as erosion increased in some areas and salinization crept into others. Fields that had been fertile for generations slowly lost productivity, not dramatically, but steadily enough to force adaptation. The Harappans were skilled adapters. They had already mastered water management, urban planning, and standardized production. Faced with environmental change, they did what they always did: adjust quietly. Some cities invested more in wells as surface water became unreliable. Others modified drainage systems. Settlements began appearing in slightly different locations, closer to remaining water sources or more stable ground. But adaptation has limits. The scale of the Indus civilization meant that small changes had large consequences. When rivers shifted, entire cities found themselves increasingly disconnected from the resources that had justified their existence. Trade routes that depended on river transport became less efficient. Agricultural hinterlands shrank or moved. Maintaining large urban populations grew harder when food production became uncertain. And all of this unfolded without the guiding hand of a centralized authority. There was no king to command massive new irrigation projects. No empire to forcibly relocate populations. Decisions were local, communal, incremental. Families moved before cities did. Neighborhoods thinned. Craftspeople followed demand. Over time, some urban centers became quieter, less dense, their infrastructure maintained by fewer hands. Archaeological layers tell this story subtly. Buildings repaired with reused bricks instead of fresh ones. Streets narrowed as space was repurposed. Drains cleaned less frequently. Construction quality declined, not because knowledge was lost, but because resources were scarcer and priorities shifted. Climate does not destroy civilizations by force. It withdraws permission. The permission to settle here, to grow this crop, to rely on that river. The Harappans were deeply attuned to their environment. Their entire civilization was built around water management. When water stopped behaving as expected, it challenged not just their economy, but their worldview. Cleanliness, order, and routine were central values. Environmental instability undermined all three. Rituals tied to water may have felt less effective. The Great Bath, once a symbol of purity and renewal, existed within a city increasingly threatened by unreliable water supplies. Wells that once symbolized abundance now reminded people of scarcity. The everyday rituals of washing, cooking, and farming became negotiations rather than habits. Yet there is no evidence of panic, no mass fortifications hastily built, no weapons stockpiled, no sudden shift toward authoritarian control. Instead, there is a gradual dispersal. Populations spread out. Smaller settlements appear farther east, closer to more reliable rainfall patterns. Urban density decreases. The great cities slowly lose their centrality. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of the Harappan response to climate change. They did not cling desperately to cities that no longer made sense. They let go. Letting go is not collapse in the traditional sense. It is transformation. As civilization organized around cities and standardized systems gradually reorganized around smaller communities, and localized strategies. Knowledge did not disappear overnight. Crafts continued. Traditions persisted. But the urban experiment, dependent on stable climate patterns, became harder to sustain. The land was not punishing them. It was changing. And the Harappans, rather than fighting the change with monuments or violence, adjusted their lives accordingly. Floodplains that once invited settlement became risky. Monsoon-fed agriculture became less dependable. Rivers that once connected regions became obstacles or empty channels. Over generations, these shifts reshaped the map of daily life. Children growing up during this period would have known a different world than their grandparents. Stories of predictable floods and abundant harvests would have sounded distant, almost mythical. Skills passed down through families would still matter, but they would be applied in new contexts on smaller scales. Climate change does not announce itself with drama. It whispers. It alters expectations. It makes yesterday's solutions less effective. For a civilization built on routine, the erosion of routine was profound. Not catastrophic in a single moment, but destabilizing over time. Infrastructure that once felt eternal now required constant adjustment. And adjustment, when prolonged, becomes exhaustion. The land, slowly and without malice, began to say no. No to dense cities in certain locations. No to large-scale uniformity. No to the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. And so the Harappan world entered a new phase, not marked by fire or conquest, but by movement. People followed water. They followed fertile soil. They followed opportunity where it still existed. The cities, magnificent in their ordinariness, were not destroyed. They were outgrown by a changing landscape. What remains in the ruins is not the story of sudden collapse, but of a civilization negotiating with forces larger than itself, and eventually accepting that the negotiation had changed. The climate did not end the Indus civilization. It simply stopped sustaining it in the same way. And in that slow withdrawal of permission, the future quietly began to unfold elsewhere. When archaeologists first began uncovering the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they expected to find familiar signs of an ending. Burned layers, broken walls, weapons left where they fell, mass graves. History, after all, had trained us to expect that civilizations end loudly, with invasion, rebellion, or catastrophe. But the soil of the Indus Valley told a different story, one that felt almost unsettling in its calm. There are no scorch marks of conquest spread across these cities, no widespread evidence of sieges, no layers of ash marking a final desperate stand, no foreign weapons littering the streets. Instead, there is silence. A silence so complete that it forces a re-evaluation of what decline really looks like. The cities did not fall. They emptied. This distinction matters. Collapse suggests force, suddenness, trauma. Emptying suggests choice, timing, and patience. The archaeological record points again and again to the same conclusion. People did not flee the Indus cities in panic. They left deliberately, gradually, and in stages. Homes were not ransacked. Storage jars were not smashed open in desperation. Tools were not scattered as if dropped mid-task. Many houses appear carefully closed, their final occupants taking valuables and personal items with them. Doors were not broken down. Walls were not breached. The city grid remained intact long after daily life had thinned. This was not an ending imposed from outside. It was an ending grown from within. In many neighborhoods, we see patterns of partial abandonment. One house falls silent, then another, then several. Streets that once echoed with footsteps become quieter, but not immediately empty. Wells continue to be used for a time. Drains still show signs of maintenance, though less frequent. The systems of the city did not fail all at once. They were simply asked to serve fewer people. People left in waves, not crowds. Families likely moved first. small units responding to subtle pressures, failing harvests, unreliable water, shrinking trade opportunities. When one household left, it did not signal alarm. Others remained. Life continued, just slightly thinner than before. Over time, the departures accumulated. This kind of dissolution leaves a very different archaeological fingerprint than violence. There are no defensive structures hastily erected, no sudden stockpiling of weapons, no signs of trauma etched into bones. Human remains from this period do not show the patterns of mass injury associated with warfare. Instead, burials continue in familiar ways, suggesting continuity of belief even as cities lost population. Even the final phases of occupation show order. Some buildings were repurposed, large homes subdivided, public spaces encroached upon by smaller structures. This suggests adaptation to a shrinking population, not collapse. People adjusted the city to suit new realities rather than abandoning it outright. And then, slowly, the adjustments stopped. At a certain point, maintaining urban infrastructure became impractical. Drains require labor. Wells require upkeep. Streets need clearing. A city designed for tens of thousands cannot function efficiently with only a few thousand. Once population density drops below a threshold, the cost of maintenance outweighs the benefit of staying. That is when abandonment accelerates. But even then, it is not chaotic. There is no final night when everyone leaves. Instead, cities hollow out from the edges inward. Peripheral neighborhoods go quiet first. Central areas persist longer, sustained by remaining trade and communal memory. Eventually, even these cores lose their purpose. What remains behind feels intentional. Broken pottery is sparse in late layers. Valuable materials are missing. There is no evidence of people abandoning wealth in haste. This suggests that those who left expected to continue living elsewhere. They did not see themselves as refugees, but as settlers relocating within a familiar world. Civilizations that collapse violently leave scars. The Indus civilization left footprints fading into sand. This quiet exit challenges deeply held assumptions about how complex societies end. We are accustomed to stories of downfall driven by invasion or internal rebellion. The Harappan case offers a different model. Dissolution without drama, change without spectacle. The absence of kings may have played a role here. Without a central authority insisting that cities be defended or preserved at all costs, decisions could be made locally. No ruler demanded loyalty to a capital. No monumental ideology tied identity to a single city. The civilization had always been decentralized, practical, and flexible. That flexibility extended to its ending. People were loyal to routines, not symbols. When routines stopped working, loyalty shifted. Trade networks adjusted. Crafts moved closer to raw materials. Agricultural communities reorganized around new water sources. What dissolved was not the culture itself, but the urban form that had defined it for centuries. In later settlements, elements of Harappan life persist. Pottery styles evolve rather than vanish. Tools continue to be made using familiar techniques. Certain symbols endure. This continuity suggests that the people did not disappear. They dispersed. The cities emptied, but the civilization did not vanish overnight. It thinned, and thinning leaves few dramatic traces. This is why the Indus civilization feels ghostly to us. Not because it was erased violently, but because it slipped quietly out of view. There is no climactic chapter, no final battle to anchor memory. Just a gradual fading, like a conversation trailing off as participants drift away one by one. Even the Great Bath shows no signs of defilement or destruction. It was not smashed by invaders. It was simply no longer used. Wells fell silent. Drains clogged slowly. Streets accumulated dust rather than rubble. Time, not violence, claimed the cities. Environmental stress likely accelerated this process. but it did not dictate its character. Climate made cities harder to sustain, but human choices shaped how they were left. The Harappans did not respond with panic or force. They responded with movement. Movement is less visible in ruins than destruction. A city burned leaves ash. A city conquered leaves weapons. A city emptied leaves space. And space is harder to interpret. Archaeologists long struggled with this emptiness. Early theories imagined invasions because emptiness felt incomplete as an explanation. Surely something dramatic must have happened. But the evidence refused to cooperate with those expectations. Layer after layer revealed calm abandonment, not catastrophe. There are no mass graves from this period. No piles of unburied bodies. No skeletons bearing widespread trauma. Instead, there is an eerie normalcy in how things were left. It is possible that people believed the cities might be reoccupied someday, that they expected conditions to improve. That leaving was temporary. Doors closed, but not barricaded. Streets were left intact, as if waiting. Civilizations that expect finality behave differently. The Harappans seem to have expected continuity elsewhere. This expectation makes sense when we remember how fluid their civilization always was. It had expanded quietly. It had adapted to diverse environments. It had spread without conquest. It had thrived without rulers. Its ending followed the same philosophy. No one ordered the cities to be abandoned. They simply became less necessary. As populations shifted eastward and southward, toward regions with more reliable rainfall, the old urban centers lost relevance. Trade patterns realigned. New hubs emerged. The ancient cities remained, but as memories rather than necessities. Eventually, even memory fades. Without a written history to anchor stories, the cities slipped into obscurity. Floods buried them, silt covered streets. Bricks were reused by later populations who did not know the names of the cities they dismantled. The grid plans vanished beneath farmland. For thousands of years, the Indus cities slept. Not destroyed, not cursed, just unused. There is something profoundly modern in this ending. In a world accustomed to loud collapses, the Harappan experience suggests that societies can end without drama, without villains, without tragedy. They can simply reorganize until the old form no longer exists. The civilization did not shatter, it dissolved. And dissolution leaves behind a different kind of legacy, one that is harder to mythologize, harder to dramatize, but perhaps more honest. It reminds us that not all endings are failures. Some are transitions so gradual that they barely register as endings at all. The empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro do not tell a story of defeat. They tell a story of people choosing to go elsewhere, quietly, patiently, without violence. And in that silence, the Indus civilization becomes not a tale of collapse, but a meditation on impermanence. After the cities emptied, something even quieter began. Not collapse, not destruction, forgetting. At first, the forgetting was gentle. The streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro did not vanish overnight. They lingered, partially used, partially remembered. A well here, a wall there. A brick repurposed into a new home built slightly off-grid, slightly improvised. For a time, people still knew these places had once been something larger, something older. But memory, like population, thins before it disappears. Rivers shifted again. Floods came not violently, but persistently. Each monsoon season carried fine silt, laying it gently across abandoned streets. Drain openings filled. Courtyards softened. Brick edges blurred. The sharp geometry of the cities began to lose definition, like writing left too long in the sun. Mud does not destroy ruins. It hides them. Fields followed. Once the land stabilized enough, grasses took hold, then shrubs, then crops. Plows passed over streets that had once been measured with near mathematical precision. Furrows cut across former intersections. Seeds fell into cracks between bricks and rooted themselves without any knowledge of what lay beneath. Generations farmed the land without knowing they were walking on cities. This is how forgetting works. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. Names were the first casualties. The people who left the cities carried memories with them, but memories fade when not anchored to place. New settlements formed. New rivers became central. New stories mattered more than old streets slowly dissolving under soil. Without writing that could preserve history across centuries, the names of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro slipped out of use. Children born generations later did not know these places as cities. To them, they were mounds, low rises in otherwise flat land, places where the soil behaved strangely, where bricks sometimes surfaced after heavy rains, where pottery shards appeared like broken teeth. Mounds invite myths, but not accuracy. Some mounds were said to be cursed. Others were said to be the remains of fortresses built by giants. Some were simply ignored. Farmers avoided digging too deeply in certain areas because tools struck stone too easily. Brick-lined channels confused plow paths. But these inconveniences were practical problems, not historical questions. No one asked who built this. The Indus civilization became invisible, not because it was forgotten in one moment, but because it was overwritten slowly by everyday life. Fields are powerful erasers. Each planting season smoothed the land further. Each harvest pressed memory down another layer. Mud brick dissolves when neglected. Fired brick survives longer, but even it yields to time when covered and reused. Bricks were valuable. Later populations mined the ruins unknowingly. Brick by brick, walls were dismantled and carried away to build new villages, wells, roads. The materials outlived the memory of their purpose. A brick that once formed part of a bath wall might later support a cattle shed. A drainage brick might end up lining a hearth. The city became raw material. As centuries passed, even the idea that these mounds were built structures faded. Oral traditions shifted. Stories adapted to new landscapes and new beliefs. Without monuments towering above ground, there was nothing to demand remembrance. Civilizations with pyramids are hard to forget. Civilizations built low, wide, and practical are easier to erase. The Indus cities had no soaring silhouettes to puncture the horizon. No stone temples rising defiantly above floodplains. Their architecture was humble by design, integrated into daily life rather than set apart from it. This humility made the cities livable and forgettable. By the time new cultures rose in the subcontinent, the Indus civilization was already a ghost with no name. Texts from later periods speak of ancient floods, lost lands, vanished peoples, but never clearly. No chronicle records a mighty city called Mohenjo-Daro. No epic laments the fall of Harappa. The silence is complete. Not a single contemporary written source mentions them. This absence shaped modern misunderstanding. When something leaves no written trace, it risks being assumed insignificant. But absence of memory is not absence of achievement. It is simply the consequence of a culture that did not prioritize self-mythologizing. The Indus people did not carve their names into stone. They carved drains. They did not raise statues of kings. They raised walls that held steady. They did not write histories meant to be read millennia later. They wrote lists, seals, transactions tools for life, not legacy. And because of that, when life moved on, legacy dissolved with it. Floodplains are especially unforgiving to memory. Unlike deserts that preserve or mountains that protect, floodplains renew themselves constantly. Each flood rearranges the surface. Each deposit erases detail. Over centuries, even large cities become gentle undulations. To a passerby, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro became indistinguishable from natural hills. The land reclaimed its permission. By the time of Alexander's campaigns, the Indus Valley was still populated, still fertile, still significant, but its ancient cities were already ancient beyond recall. No one pointed and said, "Here once stood a civilization older than all others." The knowledge was gone. Memory, once lost, does not leave ruins behind. It leaves silence. This long forgetting lasted thousands of years. Empires rose and fell above the buried cities. New languages spread. Religions transformed landscapes. Trade routes shifted again and again. And all the while, beneath fields and villages, perfectly aligned streets slept. Wells remained capped by soil. Drains stayed intact, filled but unbroken. Houses collapsed inward, and then outward, their outlines blurred but not erased. The cities waited, without knowing they were waiting. Forgetting is not an event. It is a process of no longer asking questions. Children stopped asking why the soil was hard in places. Adults stopped wondering why bricks appeared where none were made. Eventually, even curiosity faded. The land was simply the land. The Indus civilization became prehistoric, not because it was older than writing, but because it was older than memory. This distinction matters. Prehistory is not defined by time alone. It is defined by silence. The silence of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro was total. No descendants claimed them. No myths preserved their names. No rituals marked their locations. The cities passed beyond cultural inheritance into geological anonymity. Only Earth remembered. And Earth remembers differently than humans do. It remembers through layers. Each layer of soil sealed the cities more securely. Each generation walked above them, without noticing the geometry beneath their feet. The Indus civilization existed as a physical presence, but a mental absence. This is the deepest kind of forgetting. Even when people lived directly on top of the ruins, they did not recognize them as ruins. They were foundations. Convenient stone, slightly elevated ground safe from minor floods. Nothing more. Time flattened meaning. When the British arrived centuries later, even they did not immediately understand what they saw. Mounds were dismissed as debris. Bricks were reused for railway ballast. Entire sections of ancient cities were dismantled before anyone realized what was being destroyed. The forgetting nearly succeeded completely. Had archaeology not intervened when it did, the Indus civilization might have vanished without ever being named. That is how fragile remembrance is. Civilizations that shout survive history books. Civilizations that whisper risk erasure. And the Indus civilization whispered. It did not leave monuments demanding awe. It left systems demanding maintenance. When maintenance stopped, nothing demanded remembrance. Fields are patient. They do not mind what they cover. They do not care that beneath wheat and barley lie streets once walked by tens of thousands. They accept seeds, rain, and plows without question. They make no distinction between nature and history. Grass grows equally well over temples and kitchens. In this way, the long forgetting was not cruel. It was neutral. The land did what land does. People did what people do. Memory yielded to survival. Survival yielded to routine. Routine yielded to habit. Habit yielded to ignorance. And ignorance endured. For nearly 4,000 years. The Indus civilization did not haunt its successors. It did not intrude into legend or prophecy. It simply vanished from thought. That may be its most remarkable feature. A civilization so advanced that it disappeared without leaving a scar on cultural memory. No conqueror claimed victory over it. No prophet condemned it. No poet mourned it. It was forgotten because forgetting was easy. And yet, buried beneath that forgetting, everything remained. Streets aligned, wells intact, drains waiting, cities sleeping. The long forgetting did not destroy the Indus civilization. It preserved it. Hidden, intact enough to be recognized when rediscovered, but silent long enough to be misunderstood. In the quiet above the buried cities, fields continued to grow, and beneath them, history waited without knowing its own name. The rediscovery of the Indus cities did not begin with curiosity. It began with convenience. In the mid-19th century, British surveyors moved through the plains of Punjab with practical goals in mind. They were mapping land, measuring distances, marking routes for canals, roads, and railways. The landscape appeared ordinary flat fields, low mounds, villages clustered near water. Nothing announced itself as ancient. Nothing demanded attention. To the colonial eye, this was empty land with useful potential. The mounds were everywhere, but they were unremarkable. Just gentle rises breaking the monotony of the plains. Locals had names for some of them, often vague, often mythic, but no one claimed they were cities. They were simply old places. Places where the ground was hard. Places where bricks surfaced after rain. To British engineers, bricks were valuable. When railway construction accelerated across northern India, the demand for ballast-strong material to stabilize tracks grew urgent. Fired bricks were ideal, durable, uniform, already shaped. And here, scattered across the countryside, were endless supplies of them, lying just beneath the soil. Workers dug into the mounds. At first, there was no sense of disturbance. Bricks were lifted, stacked, and transported. Entire sections of ancient walls were dismantled without ceremony. Kiln-fired bricks, made thousands of years earlier, were repurposed to carry steam engines into the modern age. The past was literally crushed under iron wheels. Railway lines between Lahore and Multan, among others, were laid atop bricks taken from Harappa. Mile after mile of track rested on material shaped by hands long forgotten. No plaques marked the origin. No notes were taken. The bricks were simply bricks. This is how close the Indus civilization came to disappearing forever. It was not archaeology that found it first. It was infrastructure. Only gradually did unease creep in. Some engineers noticed something odd. The bricks were unusually standardized, almost identical in size. This was not typical of medieval ruins or recent settlements. The scale of the mounds also raised questions. They were too large, too organized, too widespread to be accidental. Still, curiosity remained secondary. It took individuals, not institutions, to slow the destruction. Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, passed through Harappa in the 1850s. He observed the mounds, noted the bricks, and collected seals bearing strange symbols. He suspected antiquity, but could not yet place it. The script was unreadable, the seals unfamiliar. There was no known civilization to attach them to. Without a name, significance remained uncertain. For decades, the sites lingered in this limbo, acknowledged but misunderstood. Excavations were shallow, records incomplete. The idea that these ruins represented a civilization as old as Egypt or Mesopotamia did not yet exist. The prevailing assumption was that India's ancient history began later. The land continued to give up bricks. Railways continued to advance. Only in the early 20th century did the full shock arrive. In the 1920s, systematic excavations began at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro under archaeologists like Daya Ramsani and R.D. Banerjee. As trenches deepened, patterns emerged. Streets aligned at right angles. Drains ran beneath them. Wells appeared in regular intervals. Houses followed repeating layouts. This was not a fort. This was not a palace. This was not a temple complex. This was a city. Not just one, but many. The realization unfolded slowly, then all at once. These ruins did not belong to any known historical period. They were older than Maurya, older than Vedic texts, older than nearly everything in South Asian recorded history. Carbon dating would come later. At first, the evidence was architectural. The scale alone was staggering. Entire neighborhoods, civic planning, uniform bricks across vast distances. The Indus civilization stepped out of the ground without warning. Shock followed disbelief. How could a civilization this advanced leave no memory? How could cities of this size vanish so completely that they were mistaken for brick quarries? How had historians missed it? The answer was uncomfortable. They had not been looking. Colonial scholarship had assumed that complex urban civilization arrived late in the subcontinent, imported or influenced from elsewhere. The idea that indigenous cities could rival the earliest urban centers of the world had not fit prevailing narratives. The Earth disagreed. As excavation expanded, the scope widened dramatically. Sites appeared not just in Pakistan, but across modern India. Hundreds, then thousands of settlements traced along ancient river systems. A civilization larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. All of it hidden in plain sight. The shock was not only academic, it was existential. Entire timelines had to be rewritten. Assumptions dismantled. Chronologies reevaluated. The subcontinent's past stretched back far further than previously acknowledged, and all of it had been nearly destroyed for railway ballast. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Modernity had almost erased antiquity before recognizing it. As news spread, excavations slowed the destruction. Railways stopped sourcing bricks from the mounds. Preservation began, though unevenly. By then, irreversible damage had already occurred. Entire sections of Harappa were gone. What remained was only a fraction of what once stood. The cities had survived floods, climate shifts, and millennia of burial. They nearly did not survive steam engines. Archaeologists approached the ruins with awe and confusion. There were no royal inscriptions to guide them, no familiar gods carved into stone, no grand tombs. The cities resisted easy interpretation. This made the discovery even more unsettling. Most ancient civilizations announced themselves loudly. Kings leave names. Conquests leave scars. Temples leave shadows. The Indus cities offered none of this. They revealed order without hierarchy, scale without spectacle, sophistication without bragging. The shock was intellectual, but also emotional. Scholars were forced to confront the fragility of historical knowledge. How many other civilizations had existed and vanished without record? How much of human achievement lay buried, mistaken for nothing? Rediscovery came with humility. Even as maps filled with new sites, understanding lagged. The script remained undeciphered, the language unknown, the people faceless. Archaeology could reveal how they lived, but not what they called themselves or what stories they told. The cities spoke only through layout, not language. And yet, what they said was profound. They showed that civilization could emerge quietly. That order did not require kings. That cleanliness could be civic, not ceremonial. That complexity did not demand monuments. The rediscovery forced a reckoning, not just with the past, but with assumptions about progress. Why had history remembered some civilizations and erased others? Why were stone pyramids celebrated while brick drains were ignored? Why did spectacle endure while systems vanished? The answers were uncomfortable. History favors noise. The Indus civilization had been too quiet. Its rediscovery was accidental because its disappearance had been complete. There were no legends to guide archaeologists, no texts pointing the way, just mounds and bricks and the stubborn refusal of the ruins to be anything other than what they were. It took the tools of modernity, railways, surveys, industrial demand to uncover what modernity almost destroyed. Even then, recognition was slow. Many early scholars resisted the implications. Some attempted to date the cities later, minimizing their antiquity. Others searched desperately for connections to known cultures, unwilling to accept independent development. The Earth continued to disagree. As dating improved, the truth settled in. The Indus cities were among the earliest urban experiments in human history. Their disappearance was not failure, but transformation. Their forgetting was not insignificance, but silence. The rediscovery changed South Asian history forever, but it also served as a warning. Civilizations can vanish so completely that even their ruins become resources. Memory is not guaranteed. Recognition is not inevitable. The Indus cities were not lost because they were destroyed. They were lost because they did not insist on being remembered. And when they finally emerged from beneath fields and railways, they did so quietly, without triumph, without proclamation, just brick by brick, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be believed, waiting for humans to realize how much they had already forgotten. When the last bricks were laid down, when the wells were sealed, when the doors were closed for the final time, the Indus civilization did not announce its ending. There were no flames licking the sky, no shattered statues, no desperate final inscriptions carved into stone. There was only movement. Footsteps leaving courtyards, hands lifting familiar tools, people turning their backs on streets they had swept for generations. The quiet decision to go. This is perhaps the most unsettling legacy Harappa leaves behind. Not how it rose, not how advanced it was, but how gently it refused to cling. Modern life teaches us to equate importance with noise. Power must be visible. Success must be displayed. Progress must leave scars on the landscape. We measure civilizations by how loudly they announce themselves, how aggressively they expand, how forcefully they refuse to be forgotten. Harappa did none of this. It built cities without kings, order without command, permanence without monuments. And when the land began to withdraw its permission, when rivers shifted, when monsoons weakened, when survival required change, it did not resist with desperation. It adapted. It dispersed. It dissolved into smaller lives, quieter settlements, memories carried in hands rather than records. This was not collapse. It was release. The Harappans did not immortalize themselves in stone. They did not carve their triumphs into mountains. They did not write their names large enough to survive catastrophe. They trusted something else. Routine, balance, the continuation of life beyond cities. In doing so, they left behind a lesson modern civilizations struggle to hear. Power does not require spectacle. The Indus world demonstrates a form of strength that does not dominate. Streets aligned not to impress, but to function. Drainage built not for display, but for dignity. Homes designed not to separate elites from laborers, but to give each household access to water, privacy, and light. There was no center shouting authority, no palace looming over rooftops, no temple demanding attention. Instead, there was repetition, brick after brick, house after house, day after day. Civilization as a quiet agreement. In our world, silence often signals failure. A company that does not advertise disappears. A leader who does not speak loudly is ignored. A culture that does not assert itself risks being erased. Harappa challenges this fear. It suggests that endurance does not always mean visibility, that a civilization can succeed without insisting on remembrance. That meaning can exist without narration. The Harappans did not build for eternity. They built for living. And when living required leaving, they left. This is perhaps the most radical act of all. Modern societies cling. We reinforce, rebuild, defend, expand, even when systems strain beyond sustainability. Rivers are forced to obey channels. Land is pushed past recovery. Growth becomes obligation, not choice. Harappa chose differently. When water patterns changed, when agriculture faltered, when maintaining urban density no longer made sense, there was no visible attempt to dominate nature into submission, no massive re-engineering, no desperate monuments to defiance. There was movement instead, families relocating, skills migrating, knowledge carried into new regions, civilization shrinking its footprint rather than enlarging it. The cities emptied, but the people did not vanish. This distinction matters. Harappa did not die. It transformed into quieter forms: villages, regional cultures, oral traditions, genetic lineages that still flow through South Asia today. The civilization dissolved into humanity rather than standing apart from it. In doing so, it escaped the fate of spectacle-bound cultures. Empires fall loudly. Their ruins become symbols of hubris. Their destruction becomes a story retold endlessly. Harappa left no such drama. It denied historians the satisfaction of catastrophe. And perhaps that is why it was forgotten. We remember what collapses violently. We forget what fades gently. The Indus cities remind us that silence is not absence. It is simply a different ending. As we lie here now, removed from that ancient world by thousands of years, yet surrounded by its consequences, there is something profoundly calming in this realization. That not everything must crescendo. That not every chapter requires a final exclamation point. Some stories end with a river quietly changing course. Harappa teaches us that order does not need rulers shouting from above. That cooperation can be invisible. That systems built for everyone, rather than for display, can endure for centuries without fanfare. Its streets were clean, not because someone demanded obedience, but because people agreed it mattered. Its cities functioned not because power threatened punishment, but because shared norms quietly guided behavior. This is governance without spectacle. It unsettles us because it removes heroes and villains from the story. There is no single figure to admire or condemn. Only collective choices, repeated daily. In the modern world, we often feel overwhelmed by scale. Nations too large, systems too complex, power too distant. Harappa offers an alternative memory, one where large populations organize themselves without losing human scale, where a city could exist without losing gentleness, where beauty did not intimidate, where spirituality flowed through water rather than towering idols, and where leaving was not failure, but wisdom. As the Indus River shifted, they did not roar in protest. They moved slowly, quietly, altering paths that had seemed eternal. The Harappans watched, adapted, and eventually followed. There is something deeply human in that choice. Not every home must be permanent. Not every achievement must be preserved. Sometimes survival means knowing when to loosen your grip. As we wind down, as the pace of history slows in our minds, imagine those final days. Not panic, not fear, just decision. A door closed gently. A tool placed down. A path taken toward a new settlement, carrying knowledge rather than regret. The streets grow empty. Dust settles. Grass creeps between bricks. The river continues, indifferent yet nourishing. Silence returns. And in that silence, the Indus civilization rests, not as a warning, not as a tragedy, but as a quiet reminder that humanity once built greatness without needing to announce it. That it is possible to live well, organize thoughtfully, and leave gracefully. The river flows on, the cities sleep, and history, for once, learns to whisper instead of shout. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, let that silence settle too. The kind that does not signal loss, but peace. The kind that follows a job done well. The kind that allows the water to move, the land to breathe, and the past to remain gentle. The river returns to itself. And so do we.